interest. I am Malika Ramsey. Thanks for joining us again this week for another informative edition. And this week we're forced actually to revisit an issue that has affected many of our Guyanese. We think it's not affecting us, but indeed it is affecting us, and that has to do with the Venezuelan threat to Guyana territory. Of course, with me, somebody who's experienced in that area to discuss that, as always, leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Mr. David Granger. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you very much, Malika.
All right. Mr. Granger, this is about the third or the fourth time we're forced to visit this issue regarding the Venezuelan threat. And I've heard sentiments from persons saying that, it may be not a big issue because in Guyana we have other issues like bread and butter issues, crime and security, which is probably related to that. How serious really is it for Guyanese? How much should we know about what is really going on in regarding the Venezuela-Guyana issue?
Well, the problem is that most Guyanese do not live in Essequibo. Most Guyanese are too young to be aware of the threats to the territorial integrity of Guyana. And most Guyanese feel they're unaffected by what Venezuela has been saying or doing, because in this day and age, Venezuela is unlikely to launch a military attack in Guyana. Maybe these things are partially true. We're not in danger of having a whole-scale attack on our country, but what has happened more or less over the last half a century is that Venezuela has actually obstructed the development of the biggest part of Guyana, that is the Essequibo region. Essequibo contains 4 regions, the Barima-Waini, more than 4, the Pomeroon, Supinam, the Cuyuni-Mazruni, Pataro-Siparuni, and the Rupununi region. There are 5 regions out of 8. And it's the richest part of Guyana. It contains most of our minerals, manganese, bauxite, to some extent gold and diamonds, our timber resources. It's the most beautiful part of the country in terms of waterfalls, savannas, mountains, forests. And it is, I would say, a part of the future, part of the development, part of the prospect of giving our people a good life. It's important to Guyana. We can't ignore the importance of Essequibo. But even prior to independence, Venezuela has been obstructing the development of the Essequibo. And what happened on the 10th of October was maybe just the latest chapter. It is not the first, but perhaps it's the worst attack that we've had. And for that reason, I think all Guyanese should be concerned.
Sir, you did say, and again, as I said before, this is not the first time, in recent times that you're speaking about this issue. Do you agree that our government, and I know you also said that you stand with government as it relates to protecting Guyana's territory, but do you believe that it's a situation where it's a state where government is not necessarily forceful enough in dealing with the issue so that we wouldn't have to have this threat over our heads?
Well, the government is not forceful enough. Sometimes I wonder if the government is aware of the background to the incident in terms of our relations with Venezuela, because I think if the government were more alert or more educated, it would take a more serious approach. And I think the problem is in incomprehension of it. That is why APNU has called for the establishment of a permanent Borders Commission so that experts could study the problem and advise the government better. Right now, I don't think the government is getting the best advice. Now, if I can go back a bit in history, if you permit me, if I don't bore the viewers.
I'm sure you won't.
Prior to independence, this issue started. Whatever the cause, we know that Venezuela, even before Guyana became independent in 1966, tried to overturn the 1899 award, in which, at that award, Venezuela was given a huge chunk of land. They weren't robbed of anything. They were given a huge chunk of land in the Orinoco Delta, and the boundaries of Guyana was defined since 1899, and Venezuela accepted that boundary, and we have accepted the boundary. The world accepted the boundary. All our maps are drawn in accordance with that boundary. But for various reasons, which I don't need to go into now, just prior to independence, Venezuela said that the agreement was void, and they started to resist. And the problem is that from about 1966 to 1968, there has been a series of incidents. And I think from the maritime point of view, Venezuela signaled its intention in July 1968 in what is called the Leone Decree. There was a president of Venezuela called President Leone, and he decreed that all of the water, all the territorial waters off of the coast of the Essequibo, I mean, this is where the boat goes to adventure, Suriname. All of those waters are Venezuelan waters. And he gave instructions to his foreign minister and his minister of defense to exercise Venezuelan sovereignty. He gave published a notice in the Times newspaper of London stating that he wouldn't recognize any exploration or concessions given to foreign companies in that area because it was Venezuelan property. So I would say for the last 4 to 5 years, Venezuela has done everything possible to prevent Guyana from developing their security. It scared off investors. We had an investor at what is called the African Manganese Company at Matthews Ridge, and they pulled out in 1968. And anytime any petroleum investor thinks or plans to come into that part of Guyana, Western Guyana, they are they're afraid that Venezuela would oppose them or attack them. So if they have property in Venezuela and they have investments in Guyana, they fear that their property would be expropriated by the Venezuelan government. So Guyanese should be concerned because most Guyanese living today are not aware, but there have been real threats to investment in that part of Guyana. Apart from that one, in 1968, there was under, I think, President Herrera campaigns, Guyana wanted to build a hydropower project called the Upper Mazruni Hydropower Project. This is before the Mile Falls Hydropower Project. And Venezuela said it wouldn't support it, and the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry sent a letter to the World Bank stating that this was Venezuelan territory and that they would not endorse any investment in a hydropower project there. So every major project that Guyana has attempted in Western Essequibo, those 5 regions, has been opposed by Venezuela. So what we saw happening on the 10th of October is really a continuation. But more than that, it's a threat that our future development of the Essequibo will be impaired by the use of armed force by Venezuela. That's how serious it is, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, I'm happy that you mentioned threat, and you did take us back to 1968. Now, probably again, I may get a similar response to what you would have said already, but do you believe that threats today coming from what happens there could be, do they have the potential to be similar to what would have happened before? Because you even talked about it, the foreign minister putting an ad saying that, more or less giving ultimatums. Do you believe that we have the potential to get back to such a situation?
Well, it's worse, because in my experience, my military experience, Venezuela has never sent an armed vessel, in this case a frigate, into our waters. The threats were always diplomatic, the threats were always verbal, the threats were always maybe administrative, if you want to call it that. People went to international fora, World Bank, United Nations, and made declarations. But this is the first time that I know that Venezuela actually sent a warship into our waters and forced an unarmed civilian vessel out of the water and charged the captain. This is serious. This is serious. This is not something we could ignore, and that is why I feel that all Guyanese must be aware of what happened in the past, because what happened on the 10th of October foreshadows more problems in the future. I think things can get worse.
Opposition leader, is the government of Guyana afraid or timid to take more forceful action because they may be concerned with damaging possible economic relations that we currently share with Venezuela. And I'm also asking this too because you were quoted in the media saying that a bag of rice is not going to solve this problem. Do you believe that government may be afraid of damaging economic relations with Venezuela?
Economic relations with Venezuela must be seen in the context of Venezuela's historical claim on Essequibo. It is not a gift, that we must be grateful for. Venezuela is a rich country, although there are internal problems. It is a very rich country. One of the most, the biggest petroleum exporting countries in the world. Now, Venezuela has given us many things in the past. On the present height, we were given a gymnasium. There were arrangements for, I think they actually built the health sciences building at the University of Guyana campus, or promised to. There were deals for bauxite, there were deals for rice, and all sorts of other economic projects before. So what is happening is nothing new. Venezuela has given Guyana gifts, and we're grateful for those gifts. But we must not, as Martin Carter said, the mouth is muzzled by the food it eats to live. But we must not allow our mouth to be muzzled by what we have received from Venezuela, because Venezuela's aim in giving those gifts is to secure benefits. I mean, that is what international politics is all about. It's not a friendly and burial society. It is hard, real politics. And Venezuela wants to get benefits. Now, we had a situation under the regime of President Carlos Andres Perez of Venezuela and Mr. Forbes Burnham of Guyana, in which he actually offered to finance the hydropower project in the Cuyuni Mazruni, and he offered to reduce the actual claim of Guyanese territory if Burnham would give him the Essequibo coast. You see, Venezuela is always driven by this desire to have an outlet to the Atlantic, what they call Salida al Atlántico. Venezuela does not have an outlet to the Atlantic. It is a Caribbean country, and its coastline is confined to the Caribbean. To get into the Atlantic, it has to pass through Guyana's waters. This is what brought about the conflict of the 10th of October. So Venezuela has always used inducements to get Guyanese governments to become more compliant, to accept, what Venezuela is asking for. So I'm not saying we shouldn't accept, but what I'm saying, we should not change our principles because of these offers of assistance from Venezuela. And in this case, I think that Venezuela, under President Hugo Chavez, under President Nicolas Maduro, the last two presidents, they have given Guyana a lot. We've had Petrocaribe, we've had rice deals. Various presidents have gone to Venezuela. President Jagan went to Venezuela. President Jagdeo went to Venezuela. I'm sure that in due course President Ramata will go to Venezuela, to Caracas, be given a medal. But we must be careful and ensure that these visits, these gifts, do not affect the principle of maintaining the territorial integrity of Guyana.
Sir, is the Guyana Defense Force responsible for securing the Essequibo coast? And of course, if they are our presence felt enough or prevalent enough in the area to avoid any possible confrontation?
In terms of strategic naval capability, it is no secret that the Guyana Defense Force Coast Guard does not have the capability to come to Venezuela. And I think the tradition in Guyana has been to avoid military conflict. I think the Guyana Defense Force and its Coast Guard are there as deterrents against Venezuelan intrusion. So, quite frankly, I don't think it is possible, militarily possible, to prevent an intrusion as occurred on the 10th of October. What they could do is provide a coast watching force, and they could provide timely information in terms of defining aggression. And once that aggression is taking place, Guyana needs to do something diplomatically. That is, if that aggression is being contrary to the United Nations Charter, bring it to the attention of the United Nations Security Council. There's a threat to international peace. And use its clout in other international fora to condemn Venezuela and get Venezuela to comply with international law. What happened in the 10th of October incident is that Venezuela broke international law. And Guyana government must say so. Rice or no rice.
So what you're saying is that really and truly we can get international assistance to deal with that if need be.
I don't call it assistance. We can bring the matter to international attention.
Okay. Let's talk about altering maritime strategy. Which country's maritime strategy, whether it be Venezuela or Guyana, needs to be altered to promote cooperation between Guyana and Venezuela instead of confrontation?
Well, we are a region, and when something happens to one state, it normally has an impact on another state. Venezuela, it must be understood, has over 7 decades of maritime and naval development. Not 7 years, 7 decades. And Venezuela has been pursuing its maritime interests with great vigor because its economy is based largely on the export of petroleum. And that export is done through the sea. Mm-hmm. So Venezuela has to be very careful and very conscious that its sea lanes, particularly to the United States, which is a major market for Venezuelan petroleum, are protected. And that protection is effected through a navy. So Venezuela has been very careful to claim a sizable portion of the Caribbean Sea. In fact, most of the Caribbean Sea, people may not realize it, most of the Caribbean Sea is claimed by Venezuela. Through its own economic EEZ. So the actual acquisition and establishment of a large navy is not an accident. It is there to serve a purpose. It's not ornamental. It is there to serve the purpose of enforcing Venezuelan control over the sea that it claims. So we're dealing with big boys here. This is a serious issue. And Guyana needs to cooperate more closely with the other Caribbean states, for example, Grenada, Barbados, and all of the other Anglophone Caribbean states in CARICOM, because this is not a bilateral matter. In fact, we are likely to lose in terms of bilateral relations, as happened in 1990 between Trinidad and Tobago on the one hand and Venezuela on the other hand. Now, both countries, Trinidad is quite small, but its hydrocarbons, that is, its pursuit of natural gas and petroleum, is very important to the Trinidadian economy. And the Prime Minister at that time, Arthur Napoleon Robinson, signed an agreement with Carlos Andres Perez of Venezuela. And this is probably what caused the maritime problem affecting Guyana. Because the two countries were so bent on their own pursuits, their own ambitions, their own interests, that they did not consult Barbados and Guyana. When you look at the naval map, the maritime map, the zones claimed by these 4 countries actually overlap. And the thing to do is to revert to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and use some consensual mechanism to determine how the boundaries would be drawn. This wasn't done. So 2 out of maybe 4 or 5 states cut up the area between themselves. The result is that a part of the sea space, which Guyana claimed, is exactly where the vessel was conducting its seismic survey on the 10th of October. Now, Guyana claimed that, and claimed that area of the sea, what is called the EEZ, which coincides with the fishery zone. And the rules for the exploitation of materials under the EEZ, the Exclusive Economic Zone, are carefully defined on the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. Now, the thing is, Venezuela is not a signatory to the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. So what Guyana claimed, Venezuela simply didn't recognize. But Guyana used the correct mechanism for defining its boundary. But Trinidad did not consult with Guyana, and Venezuela did not consult with Guyana. So we are in a situation in which our claim, which we regard as legitimate, is not accepted by two of our maritime neighbors, Trinidad and Venezuela. But Venezuela was the one to send an armed ship into our waters. Now, to the extent that Trinidad is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, perhaps we can agree with Trinidad on a boundary. But Venezuela is really greedy. It wants too much.
I'm happy that you did mention greedy, because you talked about them and the owning most of the, if owning is the correct word, Caribbean. But before I even deal with Venezuela.
Well, not owning it. The word basically, apart from your territorial sea, I mean, I don't think people use the word own. You can say you own your territorial sea, maybe up to a 12-mile limit. But beyond that is what is called exclusive economic zone, in which you have rights. Rights for minerals, rights for fishing, rights for moving your warships through and that type of thing. Other countries cannot use your EEZ the way you can use it. Other countries could use it. For example, Venezuela cannot prevent a ship carrying tourists moving between Suriname and Miami. It's not unlawful, but if you have a submarine going from Suriname to Miami, Venezuela needs to be informed and needs to grant permission. So the usage of your EEZ and your fishery zone, the usage is defined on international law.
Were we, and when I say we here, of course I mean Guyana, were we to give up what they want, what would we really be losing?
You'd be losing your birthright. You'll be losing your wealth. You'll be losing your ability to exploit minerals and fishery resources for the benefit of your children and for your country. You'll be losing it forever. It is not something that we can contemplate. We don't own it in a way our children own it. We are obliged to hand it over to our children.
You probably partially answered my next question already by saying that Venezuela is basically greedy, but what would they be gaining? Were we to give it up?
Venezuela will be gaining power and wealth. It will be gaining power because it will now have an access to the Atlantic, which is pursued for the last 70 years. And it will have more access to wealth, more fishing grounds, more minerals, whatever is discovered there. And it's an area of great potential. That's why Guyana has been giving licenses, and that's why Venezuela has been resisting. Even the establishment of the Beale Aerospace Corporation in the Guyana in 2000 was opposed by Venezuela. They said it's going to be a military outpost to be used against Venezuela. And there's nothing of the sort. It's just a tracking facility. Several petroleum exporting companies, petroleum exploration companies, not exporting companies. For example, Exxon had applied for licenses, and Venezuela scared them off. It's a policy of intimidation. So we're losing. We lost the ability to develop hydropower 30 years ago. We lost because we lost World Bank funding. We also lost a lot of investors. We don't know what we lost because people are afraid to come in because they feel that Venezuela is going to attack them. We lost the Beale Aerospace. We lost the people who were doing exploration last October. We've lost a lot. I mean, even under, I think, President Luis Herrera campaigns, or President Caldera, one of the earlier Venezuelan presidents, a German company was coming in to do petroleum exploration, and we lost them. They drove them out. Venezuela has been very aggressive in chasing people out of the Essequibo. It's not something we can continue to ignore. Even though It doesn't affect us back here in Georgetown and Sophia. It affects our children in the long term.
I'd like to get two sets of recommendations from David Granger, the Partnership for National Unity in this whole issue. But before I ask that, just to make it clear, so the Venezuelans are serious enough to attack countries that would help Guyana.
Well, I won't use attack in a military sense.
Okay.
Venezuela has blocked, I would say, commercial or corporate interests in those areas. Okay. If a big corporation is planning to explore, and if it has interest in Venezuela, it will think twice. For example, if it already has a petroleum company in Venezuela and it is exploring further afield, because you have to keep looking for new areas for exploitation, and Venezuela says, do not go into Guyana because the territory going on is ours, it is a threat that your own property in Venezuela could be expropriated or could be subject to sanctions. So prudent companies, prudent corporations would probably decide not to proceed if Venezuela issues such a threat, and Venezuela has been issuing threats.
As we prepare to wrap up this edition, first set of recommendations, what would David Granger and the Partnership for National Unity recommend to the government of Guyana in terms of dealing with this Venezuela threat issue? That's the first set of recommendations.
My first response would be that the government does not know it all, and the government should establish some mechanism for consultation with the opposition. The government should form some form of inter-party committee or commission so that all of these issues could be dealt with at the national level. At the same time, that is through Parliament, preferably. At the same time, in the government itself, they should set up a border security commission, border national security commission, so that Guyana, like other mature democracies, could have a repository of all of these maps and agreements and all of the information that is required to advise our diplomats, our negotiators, and our policymakers about the conflict. You cannot expect a new Minister of Foreign Affairs, you cannot expect a new president, you cannot expect a new Minister of Defense to come into office and know everything that has happened for the last 70 years. So it is a strategic error for persons in office to go into negotiation without being given the best advice. And I would say, to start with, we need to do those two things. One, set up a proper Border National Security Commission that accumulates this information, that is the expert. And second, set up a mechanism for consultation with the opposition.
Final sets of recommendations. I don't know if this will be included in what you just mentioned, but were we to move from cooperation to confrontation with Venezuela, what would you possibly recommend to the Army, the Guyana Defense Force? How would you probably advise them on dealing with such a situation?
Well, I've been in that situation before, and what I would say with all seriousness is that Guyana Defense Force has to work along with the diplomats. It's a question of defense, balancing defense and diplomacy. It's not one or the other. It's not either or. The two have to work together. But the defense force must be prepared to define and even deter aggression. And the diplomats must be prepared, once that aggression is defined and determined, to go out into international bodies and give representation. So the defense force has to be strong, it has to be alert, it has to ensure that there are no breaches. For example, the breaches that occurred at the entering ban on the 31st of August, and I think it occurred later on, there was a second incident. So the GDF has to be ready to provide information to the diplomats, but the diplomats have to go out there and do the work. So let us walk on two legs, defense and diplomacy.
Thank you very much, sir. Well said as always. This has been another edition of The Public Interest. Of course, we were discussing the current Venezuela threat to Guyana's territory. I am Malika Ramsey, of course, leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Mr. David Granger. Join us again next time. Goodbye.